Hello and welcome to Cafe DC. I'm Faiz Rahman. Today, Ambassador Islam Siddiqui joins us on the show and we'll discuss with him a few things about his very high-profile role in the Obama administration and also his days during the Clinton administration. So let's just go to him and talk to him about what's going on these days. Dr. Saab, you just resigned from your position and now you're a private citizen. And as ambassador of international agriculture, a very high profile global position, and you were basically traveling all around the world. Why did you decide to resign? And even though you had the chance to continue?
Let me first thank you and Voice of America for having me this morning on the Cafe DC program. The answer to your long question is very simple. After serving for 4 years as Chief Agriculture Negotiator for the Obama administration, it entailed a lot of travel all around the world, as you said. But on top of that, this was a job which is 24/7 job. And other choice was to continue full second term, which means until 2016. And I felt there are a lot of other things I can do in order to, in my career, which has been rounded not only in government but private sector. Now I have joined a think tank, policy think tank in Washington, D.C., which allows me to do some more creative things.
Dr. Saab, I think it's pretty much a common practice in the U.S. government. Those who are political appointees, they serve 1 or maybe 1.5 terms, and then before the administration is just over, they go into the private sector. And for, I think, one of the main reasons being cited is basically to make more money, because as government functionaries, they don't make good money. So is that true in your case as well, that you want to make more money a little bit?
That actually was not the primary consideration, but if I do get some consulting contracts, and I'm sure I'll welcome that opportunity. Right now, my sole focus is to be involved in the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, which is a very well-known policy think tank in Washington, D.C. area, and I'll be working in the global food security area, which is a very important area not only for developed countries, especially for developing and least developed countries.
Very good. You were in California before you joined the Clinton administration as first as Deputy Undersecretary of Agriculture at the Department of Agriculture, and then you became the Undersecretary of of Agriculture. So that was a pretty very high profile position in the administration. What it was like to work in that White House, in the Clinton's White House, so to speak?
Number one, let me just say I've been blessed to have served 2 presidents, first between 1997 and 2001 in the Clinton administration in very significant high profile what you call Senate confirmed jobs, and now last 4 years in the Obama administration. I would say it was a lot more travel in both jobs, but I think the greatest honor I had when President Clinton went to India on his state visit in 2000. I had the honor to be the part of the U.S. delegation, go to the country of my birth with the president of my newly adopted country, and I will remember that very fondly.
And that was quite a long visit, right?
That is correct.
Very, very long visit, and it made lots of headlines. How do you compare, or actually, how do you think of the diversity that these 2 administrations offered, both the Clinton and the Obama administrations? Do you see any difference, any improvisation on what President Clinton did when it came to diverse?
If you look at the number of appointees of Asian American origin and minorities in general, I think Clinton administration's record is very clear that he tried to bring minorities from all shades of American walks of life, and same thing with the Obama administration. If you look at the number of Asian Americans in the Obama administration,
I think you were probably the highest ranking Muslim in the Clinton administration.
And same true in the
Obama administration. But was there any other Muslim at the similar level before you? In any other U.S. administration?
So the answer is no. I think in order, so you have the president and then you have the political appointees who are confirmed by the Senate. So these are, so I was the presidential appointment in both administration, and this is actually a great honor to have been someone who...
So the first the most high-profile Muslim member, a political appointee of any U.S. administration. This you carry that distinct honor.
That is, to my knowledge, is correct.
Very good. Dr. Saab, basically now coming back to your actual profession, you've been all along your life, you've been basically involved in food security, agricultural issues. Countries like Pakistan, India, and other developing countries have almost, this is at a crisis level that they face this issue, the food security. So how do you compare what is done here in this country, how they can benefit from your research and your work in this field?
This whole area of global food security has got new meaning and new awareness after the food riots in 2007 and 2008 in about 28 different countries in Asia and Africa. And you'll say why those riots took place? Because the prices of food shot up and the food became out of reach for many, many millions of people in Asia and Africa. So
it's not just the security of food, it's also inflation, because food becomes scarce.
So when food becomes scarce and more costly, it's not as accessible by poor people. And that's why both in the G20 level discussions or G7 country discussions, leaders have been very much focused on this issue. And so to answer your question, how US and developed countries like US and European Union can help least developed countries, I think the answer is very simple. Through technology transfer, where countries like the US, which is a leader in agricultural sciences, some of the best known universities in the world, agriculture universities, they can impart and do capacity building in developing countries and least developed countries.
So during your role as the ambassador of agriculture, negotiations, and as the top negotiator actually, when it came to agriculture issues, did you see some kind of a desire on their part, the people overseas, that they really want to be helped, or they think it's just life as usual, it's okay?
It's a two-part answer. Each of these countries I mentioned is interested in improving their food security, because if there's no food security, politically there will be a lot of instability and turmoil. So I think these governments are interested in improving their food security. How they do it, this is an issue. Like in India, in 2013, Indian Parliament passed a bill which was signed by the President, which is called National Food Security Bill. It's a $25 billion project which will make available access to food to poor Indians. So that's a good thing. Now, how you do it, that became a debate in the Bali ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization, where I was there. Right. So how you do it is one issue. Like in the US, when we help 45 million Americans who are poor and through the food stamp program, we don't give that money to the farmers. We give the money, the stamps are given to the users, and users who are qualified go to the food store to buy the food. In India's program, the food security program, that money is going to be transferred to the farmers, who will be able to raise prices for their products and all that. And this is inconsistent with India's WTO obligations, so it became a big issue. But at the end of the day, both the US and the Indian government came to a compromise, and which is a good thing, that we were able to make the Bali ministerial meeting a success.
Well, Dr. Saab, Ambassador Islam Siddiqui, the sun is shining again on us, so we just want to take a short break here, and after we come back, we'll talk more about your community activism, that you've been involved in the Muslim American community and organizations for a long time. So let's take a short break and let's see what you have to say on these topics. We'll be right back. Stay with us, please. Welcome back to this beautiful day here in Washington, D.C. And now back to our guest, Ambassador Dr. Islam Siddiqui. Dr. Saab, before our break, we were talking about how your role in the community activities and its own development. But before I go to that topic, I want to touch upon briefly on your current assignment. Like I said before the break, I mean, a lot of political appointees, when they leave the administration, they join some kind of a think tanks or universities. So in your case, of course, CSIS. So basically, what you do there, and please tell us about your role and the hierarchy that you have joined.
As a senior advisor, I'll be working on global food security issues and trade issues at CSIS. And the role senior advisors play in think tanks is they are overseeing reports which are being prepared, and these reports are designed to help government decision making in terms of policy areas, how US can help in providing food securities to least developed countries and developing countries. Yesterday I was at a day-long conference organized by the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, which again talked about how climate change is going to affect global food security. So these are the kind of work which is done, and then you have, I'm sure you've heard of senior fellows or senior associates,
Right.
and then you have the hierarchy, senior advisors, and then distinguished advisors.
Okay, so you're a senior advisor. And to mention a few names, Dr. Henry Kissinger and
Many of the senators, former senators like Senator Sam Nunn,
they are
all
now
part of
advisors at this
and
CSIS.
distinguished advisors.
Very good. You know, how do you see this progression of the Muslim community from being just a very small, minuscule group of people scattered around the country? Now they're a little bit more organized. They have conventions. They have huge organizations like ISNA, ICNA, and others. So how do you see this this process?
I came to the United States as a student from India on a scholarship in 1964. So this year will mark exactly 50 years
Wow.
of my being
And
in
how
the
old
US.
are you? 55?
Yeah, I'm still 55 and
Okay.
counting.
So you're a very young student, I guess.
So I came to University of Illinois, and it's another very significant fact that Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, which is not right now known as ISNA, was actually established. Its predecessor, Muslim Student Association, or MSA, of US and Canada, was actually established at the University
Right.
of Illinois in 1963. So I've been working off and on with ISNA all these years from 1964. So I think my development in California has been, in addition to being the senior most Muslim American in California government and then subsequently in US government, I also been very active in both the activities helping community as a board member of the Sacramento Muslim Mosque, then the president of Sacramento Muslim Mosque Association. Then we also were involved as the founding member of the United Muslims of America, which is a now 32-year-old organization and counting.
UMA, right?
UMA, which has been very active in the political action area.
How do you see this, freedom of religion in this country? Of course, there have been problems.
I have to say, in terms of freedom of religion, I cannot say any better country where you can exercise your religion of your choice is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. While after 9/11, there has been a lot of Islamophobia and a lot of the issues which we have to deal with there. But I have to tell you, in terms of Muslims being able to practice their religion, I do not see any problem, because if you look at the growth of masajids in the U.S. is phenomenal. Of course, I always have believed, and that's why I was involved in the Ummah's creation. We have to be not only active in terms of practicing our religion, but also becoming an integral part of the political process, so that decision makers and policy makers in Washington, D.C., and state capitals and local governments know that we are citizens of this country or the county or the state, and we are contributing to the good of this country while we are American Muslims.
Dr. Saab, during your California days, especially during the Clinton administration, when I was also in California, Los Angeles, running Pakistan Link, one of the biggest debates that was going on back then, and we covered that a lot, whether the Muslims and the minorities should take part in elections, especially in presidential elections, because a lot of people, they thought it wasn't a good idea to be part of the system, because it wasn't to their advantage at all. but things have changed. So please, tell us about something that why people actually thought that way initially, and now how it's changing, the whole paradigm is shifting.
That debate, actually, you're right, was taking place in the 1970s and early 80s, but that debate is no more. And I would say one single most contributing factor, in my opinion, was the tragic events of 9/11. After that, not only many Muslims realized that we have to actually proactively project the image of Islam, that we are citizens of the country, we are Muslims, and we are here to stay, and we are contributing to the society here. So the people who brought about these tragic events were not representing Islam. These were the deviants from the true religion of peace. So that's number one. Number two, in my opinion, if you look at, there are two Muslim congressmen in the U.S. Congress.
Congressman Keith Ellison and Congressman Andre Carson.
And there are a lot of other state senators and state representatives around the country, some of the mayors and council chairs. So in Maryland, there's two Muslims running for as delegates for the assembly in Maryland. So I think this is a new phenomenon. So I don't see that debate which was taking place, should Muslims be involved.
So that debate has died down, basically.
That is my conclusion.
Okay, now, yes, of course, when people become mayors, members of Congress, and people like, high-profile executives in, political administrations, how does that benefit the community? What is the direct benefit that a member of the community derives from these facts or these developments?
I think the biggest benefit I see in the long range for our generations, future generations. We are still a very tiny minority. If you look at the number of 330 million Americans, we are about 7 or 8 million. So it's a very small pie in the overall numbers. But if other Americans see that they are Muslim names, they are Muslims who are contributing a part of the government, business, medical doctors, lawyers, in media, I think they're at ease, because what they see on the media about some of the unfortunate events overseas, they tend to associate Islam with those events. But so when they see Muslims, American Muslims being involved, and they are neighbors, they see they are peaceful, they are contributing to society, they are doctors and lawyers and all this. I think that is the overall benefit. But in terms of direct benefits, I think we can serve as a role model for other and the younger generation, and that's what I do in my personal time, talking to interns who are working on the Hill or in government. One common question is, how did you reach where you are today? So I feel that many of us have an obligation to give back to the community in terms of guiding and mentoring the younger generation.
Dr. we have to take a short break here. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Faiz Rahman, and we are talking to Ambassador Dr. Islam Siddiqui on Cafe DC. Well, Dr. Saab, so the question was basically, what's the direct benefit that the community derives from all these high-profile appointments, these high-profile elections? Yes, we have people on the table, but a common Muslim in the community, is it to his benefit that he works so hard on these campaigns, and what benefits they derive out of this?
Again, if you are not on the table, you are on the menu, so as to speak. So I think being on the table means when issues are being discussed, whether surveillance of masajids or say some other programs Congress is debating, I think being there and having two congressmen in the House of Representatives is good. Keith Ellison, when these issues arise, he is there defending the Muslim point of view in U.S. Congress. Same thing when I came as a Deputy Undersecretary, one was establishing halal standard for meat. And also, I also advocated that this is not good for consumption of beef and other meats in the U.S. halal meat, we can also make
Export.
use of the export, because other countries like France and Australia and New Zealand have captured this market. in
The
Middle East.
Australians are doing very well. Yeah.
So this is one example how you, and same thing whether it be in foreign policy.
So
or
one is
defense.
basically the macro level where policy making, where you have to be on the table to make sure that your point of view is also heard and taken into consideration. And then the micro level, at the grassroots level, I think it does create job opportunities for the people, and and bring some role models in the picture.
That's correct. And also just one example, which when I was in USDA, the Bosnian War was going on, and this is a very small story, but it makes a point to your question. There's a lot of pork available. There's a surplus of pork, and USDA was considering sending pork to Bosnia. And I was in those meetings, says, most of the Bosnians are Muslims. They don't eat pork. So I think that's just one example, having someone on the table who knows.
Yeah, you made a big difference. Otherwise, the whole thing would have gone to waste. Basically.
It would have backfired also.
Yeah, exactly. Rasa, before this program, we were talking about your days in the administration, and one story that and actually one aspect of it, that the austerity in the US government, how these very high profile, and you were a very high profile, very high level official, but you weren't allowed to travel the way you wanted to. So tell us something about this austerity drive going on in the administration and how it's affecting the bureaucrats and the politicians.
Actually, many people in your audience will appreciate it's not only the issue of austerity, also high standard of ethics in U.S. government. So much so that any gift more than $10, I have to report to the U.S. government. So if you go to a reception,
whether you receive it here
or overseas. And so going to many of the business dinners where industry is paying for it, I cannot accept, especially private dinners. I have to pay my own way. If I'm as a speaker, as a government official in a widely attended meeting, I can accept that dinner or lunch if I'm a speaker. But this is unethical for U.S. officials to accept any. And if you do have something, you have to report back and pay for it also. So that's one example. Austerity part is also that most of both the career employees and political appointees travel by economy or coach class. If your trip was more than 13 hours, then you can qualify for.
Even for the cabinet level officials, no first class travel.
First class, actually,
commercial.
Business class travel was allowed before the budget cuts of last year. After the sequester cuts in 2013, even the cabinet level people, and myself as being the sub cabinet level people,
if they use
travel
a commercial flight,
commercial
then they cannot,
flights. Yeah. And one example which will tell you. I traveled in early December to go to Bali via San Francisco to Hong Kong to Bali. This was about 40-hour plus trip if you include the layover in between those two stopovers. Would you believe I had to travel economy because the U.S. government would not allow business class. And many of the ministers and the officials from other developing countries who were traveling on the same flight from Hong Kong to Bali, actually they were sitting in first class, business class, and my boss was a cabinet member, and myself, we were in economy class.
So the American ministers were in the economy class, and all the others were in first class, having all the fun. Well, Dr. Saab, another very important subject, not just here in this country, but around the world, is climate change and global warming. There has been a lot of resistance to this whole idea. Even in this country, there are people, very important people, who still just refuse to take this into account. They think it just doesn't exist. So being, and you were an important part of this administration, what do you think of this? What's going on? I mean, why there's so much resistance, and if something is not done quickly, how is it going to affect the planet?
That's number one. Climate change is here. It's happening. If you look at the extreme weather events, whether it be in California, in Southwest, seeing the drought level and shortages of water, which is unprecedented. Hurricane or Typhoon Haiyan which is the worst disaster to happen, the intensity of it. So I think these extreme weather events are happening more regularly with more frequency. So debate in the U.S., I think this is a human nature. Unless you're personally affected by some crisis, you don't see unless the crisis is knocking on your door, and so as to speak. So,
but isn't it like an exact science in a way?
I think
Or not?
scientists have been watching this thing, and when you have this change happening with gradually and all this, there's a lot of data which has to be modeled and all this. But if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC report which came out, these are world's topmost
So in your opinion, the naysayers do have some point when they reject this whole
I think
phenomenon.
there's a less number of people who are doubting the climate change, but I have to tell you, if they had to ration water in California where 300,000 acres of land is not being planted, they have to decide whether they want to let the orchards, orange orchards, apple and walnuts dry, or not plant cotton or tomatoes. So naturally they're not planting cotton and tomato, which are annual crops, in order to save their orchards. So point I'm making is, I think more and more people will start believing, but the question arises how these developed countries are adapting to and getting ready for deal with it. If, let's say, there's climate change or even 5 or 6 inches of rise in the sea level, thousands and thousands of acres in Bangladesh will not be able to plant rice in those areas. So these are some of the climate change
Some
effects.
very practical impact which people will see.
So the answer to this is, how do we prepare? So we have to look at, for California or desert perspective, look at crops which are tolerant to drought and tolerant to high temperatures. For areas, flood-prone areas, we have to find crops which are tolerant to salt water so they can be planted in salty and marshy areas.
Ambassador Dr. Islam Siddiqui, thank you very much for being here on this show. Thank you for your thoughts and this enlightening opinions that you have given us and our audiences. Well, thank you very much for watching Cafe DC. I'm Faiz Rahman. Please do visit our website urduvoa.com and give your feedback through our Twitter handle and Facebook account. See you next week. Goodbye.